Hello. It will not come as a surprise to you that I'm Otto Peninsler. I'm in my office at the Mysterious Bookshop in Manhattan, and we're talking today about collecting first editions of one of my favorite writers and one of the most unusual and creative writers of his time, Fredric Brown. Fredric Brown was called by Mickey Spillane my favorite writer of all time, and which is heavy praise for the writer who at that time was the best-selling writer in the world. Mickey is a very hard-boiled writer, and Fredric Brown is often described as a hard-boiled writer, but he's not. The truth is the violence and the kind of thing that you would expect from hard-boiled writers just don't exist in Brown's books. There are murders, of course, because he's a mystery writer and a crime writer, but the violence is off stage, and they're essentially almost cozy books. Well, they have very colorful backgrounds where you would think that it might be not just colorful, but prone to a certain amount of violence, which doesn't actually exist. He wrote several books that were set in the carnival world, and the first one was called The Fabulous Clip Joint, which was published in 1947 and won an Edgar as the best first mystery of the year. It introduced a crime solving team of Ed and Am Hunter, a nephew, an uncle and his nephew, being the crime solvers in six books, I think, and very colorful. At least one more also appeared with a carnival background. He has weird. His books are slightly weird. There's a hint that there are supernatural elements in some of the books, but much like John Dixon Carr, where you think there are supernatural things happening, they're always explained rationally. But the titles, one of the things that I always found attractive when I was reading him in the years ago, I couldn't resist some of the titles. Let me just give you a few. Um, the Wench is Dead. Who uses the word wench after the 17th century? The Screaming Mimi. The Screaming Mimi became a movie starring Anita Ekberg, the Swedish blonde bombshell. But you have to go back a long time to remember who Anita Ekberg was. Only people who were born 1,000 years ago will remember her. But Mrs. Murphy's Underpants. Who would think that that's a good title for a book? But that's the kind of titles that he commonly used. And then some that are a little bit more traditional. His Name Was Death, The Deep End, um, The Murderers, um, The Dead Ringer, a little more traditional. He wrote over 300, and I'll get to talking about the first editions in a minute. He wrote over 300 mystery stories. He also wrote a lot of science fiction, at least five novels, and many, many short stories. And so you would think that with that background, that he might have used science fiction or fantasy or supernatural elements in his crime novels, but he didn't. He hinted at them, including in my favorite book, The Night of the Jabberwock, which has many Alice in Wonderland references. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy, but because I always sell it, it always sells very quickly. But the short stories were really good. I mean, they were erratic because there's 300 of them, and they weren't all masterpieces. But so many of them were really good when he wrote for the pulps, and they have two titles too. They were collected in 20 volumes of collecting all of his short stories. And here's samples. There's Three Corpse Parley, Pardon My Ghoulish Laughter, The Gibbering Night, and Madman's Holiday. Madman's Holiday, the title story in this collection, was filmed with Edmund O'Brien. A really fascinating, it's a fascinating story about an art expert who was in a train crash, and he is not injured. He goes to a museum where a valuable painting has been stolen, and when he meets with the police tell him there was no train crash. So, in order to find out what happens, you have to get a copy of Madman's Holiday. Now, the one thing that makes Fredric Brown easy to collect, he's hard to collect because the books were fairly cheaply produced. They didn't hold up very well. The bindings were cheap, pressed paper, as opposed to cloth. You can tell by the texture that there's no cloth there, and as a result, it was very common for them to have wear at the foot of the spine. But what makes him easy to know whether you have a first edition, all of his books were published by Dutton. Not the short story collections, but all of the novels and a couple of early short story collections were all published by Dutton. And there was no publisher in America that was easier to tell a first edition. There's a date on the title page. And on the copyright page, it says first edition. It takes all the suspense out of knowing whether or not you have a first edition. And I can show you that with all of these books. Again, Mrs. Murphy's Underpants, date on the title page. First edition on the copyright page. The hard part is getting the books in really great condition. Because I'm such a huge Fredric Brown fan, I have a bunch of beauties. This one is particularly hopeless to find in great condition, and I'll show you why. The dust jacket is taller than the book. It was published too tall. If the camera can show you that, there's an extra ½ inch. Can you imagine how a dust jacket stayed in this condition, being a ½ inch taller than the book itself? Of course, every copy you would ever find is frayed and torn and so on, except this one, best copy in the world. But also, I could show you on the copyright page again. This goes back to the 40s. It's the second book, and again on the copyright page, there it is, first edition. This is where you don't need me or any other expert to tell you how to tell a first edition. He wrote about 20, maybe 25 novels, and the 20 short story collections that I pointed out, all of which were published by the same publisher, Macmillan. Dennis Macmillan published that series of 20 stories that collected his pulp fiction. That's it. That's Fredric Brown.